Thank you for coming to today's briefing, today's Helsinki Commission briefing on new media in authoritarian regimes. Apologize for starting late. We are expecting the possible presence of some of our commissioners, so if they do, we'll turn the floor over to them. This is a briefing. It's being transcribed and I think televised on the HouseNet. Unlike an official hearing, we will be taking questions from the audience, so as you listen to the presentations, please be thinking about good questions so we can have a good, lively, informative, and somewhat informal conversation today. And that also goes for the panelists. We can certainly talk amongst the panel as well. Not going to spend too much time introducing the topic. The Helsinki Commission is an organization going back to 1976. We monitor the implementation of the Helsinki Accords, the Helsinki Final Act, across 56 participating states. The United States is one, all of Central Asia, Europe, Canada as well. And you know, one of the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Act is, of course, the freedom of media. And of course, it's often through that, either freedom of media or freedom of speech, freedom to communicate, that we learn of other infringements or other issues, be it religious freedom or freedom of assembly. You know, obviously, if you don't have a telephone or a newspaper or an email, it's hard to hear about those things. Another thing we do quite often is election observation. In this past year, two very prominent cases, Moldova and Iran, where technologies such as Twitter played quite a major role. And happy to have Senator Brownback. Senator Brownback, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry to come in late. I apologize about that.
This is the pan.
Oh, good, good. If you don't mind me making a quick statement, I want to apologize to people for arriving late on a very important topic, and my apologies for doing it. I have a brief opening statement I'd like to make, and then hear the panel presentation. I'm delighted to see this hearing taking place. I think we saw this demonstrated in real-life form in the Iranian elections and the follow-up afterwards of how Twitter turned against the tyrants in Tehran. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the committee and the Commission for holding this very important and timely hearing on the crucial role that new media plays and will continue to play in closed authoritarian societies. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the breaking of the Berlin Wall, we must gather our strength and commit ourselves to finding ways to tear down the new walls of the 21st century, the cyber walls, an electronic censorship technology used by tyrants to repress the free expression of millions around the world. I look forward to learning from these distinguished panelists how we can move forward on this issue. Let me first say a quick word about the freedom of information and specifically Internet freedom. If information is the adrenaline of democracy, then our Internet-driven society is on high endorphins. Individual citizens have never before had so much access to real-time political, economic, and social information affecting their lives, and generally this has led to increased accountability and better outcomes. Recently, we've seen the other side of the information spectrum. In Iran this past summer, the real battle took place and is still taking place on blogs, Facebook, and Twitter as Iranians struggle to tell their story while the regime desperately tries to block access to the Internet. The same was true for the Burmese opposition in 2007, where the junta struggled to contain the fallout from its bloody crackdown. Before that, text messaging played a crucial role in the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. One thing is clear. While physical brutality will always be the tool of oppressors, 21st century authoritarianism has already been defined by the lengths to which autocrats will go to limit online access to information. The Iranian dictatorship, the Chinese Communist Party, the Burmese junta, the Castro regime, and other regimes worldwide all derive a large share of its power through media suppression and rigorous Internet censorship. But before we discuss how to tackle this problem, I think we must understand its cause. Why do regimes monitor, limit, or even block the use of the Internet? Surely allowing open use of the Internet, a modest investment, would make life for residents of these societies more bearable and more efficient. And the answer clearly on the regime's parts is control and survival. Free and open access of the Internet would allow unfettered criticism of regimes that sustain themselves only by forcibly perpetuating the appearance of perfection. These dictators not only shield their population from their own brutality, but also block information about the basic freedoms enjoyed by millions worldwide. Leaders of these oppressive regimes disdain criticism and challenge because it pushes back against this fiction of success they peddle to the masses. As the fiction crumbles, their grip on power dissolves. Like with the Polish Solidarity movement, the defiance of the people eventually cracked the defiance of the government. This is why we must focus our efforts on promoting the freedom of information, specifically Internet freedom. As individual information exchanges become effortless through wireless communications, authoritarian regimes must devote ever more resources to maintain their electronic wall. If information is power, then it is time to help bring the power to the people. We must ensure that all closed society residents have free and open access to the Internet. This is the surest and most cost-effective way to jumpstart liberty. Indeed, the more the oppressed see and understand the real nature of their regime, and the more they share with the outside world, the more power they will have to determine their own future. This is a key effort on our part to open up the Internet to regimes and to the people in these regimes that suppress their action and their access to it. So it's my hope that hearings like this today will help us in getting funding for groups that provide access to Internet, to Twitter, to Facebook, to other social media, that we can provide that and help these, in many cases, very difficult operations that people are putting together on private dollars to open up the Internet to people that don't have access to it themselves. So I hope that we can do that. I want to thank the panel very much for allowing me to come in a little bit late and put forward that statement, and I look forward to hearing some of the comments from other individuals here.
Thank you, Senator. We can proceed with the panel, starting with Daniel Collingert, Deputy Director of Programs at Freedom House. And I might add that the more extensive biographies should be on the table outside and will be posted on our website, but we'll just, given the fact that we have 5 panelists, we'll go ahead and start with the discussion. So, Daniel, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kyle, and many thanks to the Commission for inviting me and Senator Brownback. We very much appreciate your interest and leadership on this issue. New media has created significant opportunities for advancing freedom in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes. It has expanded the space for free expression and facilitated civic activism. But authoritarian regimes have pushed back. They have restricted Internet freedom in a variety of ways, and they are likely to further limit the space for free expression and civic activism on the Internet unless the U.S. government works proactively and vigorously to keep that space open. The impact of digital media on authoritarian regimes was evident in Iran following the rigged presidential election of June 12. Digital media made important contributions to the green movement of post-election protests. The movement's leader, Mir Hussein Mousavi, communicates to Iranians primarily through his blog and Facebook. Protests are announced and organized largely via the Internet, and images of police crackdowns and of defiance by protesters often are transmitted across Iran and to the outside world through Facebook and Twitter with the help of anti-censorship technology. The Green Movement was sparked by public anger over the blatant electoral fraud committed by supporters of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but it is kept alive in large part by the use of new media. Citizens in the former Soviet Union have used new media to assert their rights and to challenge abuses of power. In Russia, for example, the Internet was the primary means for drawing attention to fraud in this month's local elections. when observers in the Moscow district of Zyablikovo found a group of individuals hired to vote for United Russia multiple times. They used Twitter and LiveJournal blogs to spread the news immediately and to publish photos of the violators. A member of that district's electoral commission, Andrei Klukin, gave an online interview to describe in detail the plan behind this fraud. The interview was widely viewed on Russian YouTube and covered by several traditional media outlets. Another group of observers published video footage of a polling station chairman in the city of Azov as he tried to mix fraudulent ballots, which had already been filled in for United Russia, with legitimate ballots. This video became a hit in the Russian blogosphere and prompted a criminal investigation of the polling station chairman. Digital media spread the news of vote fraud in Russia's local elections and contributed to a real-world response. The news triggered a public demonstration on October 12 in Moscow's Pushkin Square and prompted all three opposition parties to walk out of parliament in protest. In Belarus, traditional media is highly restricted. In the Freedom House ratings of freedom in the press, Belarus is near the bottom. It's ranked 188th out of 195 countries. But the internet actually provides extensive space for free expression and activism. Most internet users in Belarus turn to non-state sources for news. In fact, the top 20 news and information websites, only 3 are state-run sites. 12 are independent or pro-opposition, and the rest focus on sports or other non-political subjects. I can also point to another example of online activism in Kazakhstan, where there was a new law passed in July to restrict the internet. And while that law was being considered, a local free speech group, Adil Soz, organized an online campaign that used blogs and Facebook and Twitter to mobilize opposition to the bill. And there was also, obviously, international criticism of the bill and criticism in other places in Kazakhstan. The bill eventually passed, but one of the key provisions, which would have given prosecutors the authority to suspend media outlets without a court order, that provision was removed from the law. So I think the online campaign had some effect. While new media plays an important role in expanding free expression and facilitating citizen engagement, it does not drive political change. New media alone cannot undermine authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes in the former Soviet republics and elsewhere continue to repress their citizens, and this repression extends to digital media. In Russia, for example, internet freedom has declined significantly in recent years as bloggers have become subject to hacker attacks, legal prosecution, and physical violence. Although there is no technical filtering in Russia, officials often make phone calls to pressure web hosts or internet service providers to remove unwanted content. The director of a leading hosting company, Masterhost, admitted that his company gets about 100 requests a day to remove content from inconvenient, so-called inconvenient websites. In Belarus, authorities conduct surveillance on internet users, and they require cyber cafes to register each user's browsing history. Kazakhstan's government, as mentioned before, introduced a law in July to regulate, but really to restrict the internet. And this law makes all forms of internet content, whether websites, blogs, chat rooms, subject to the same restrictions that are in place for traditional media. The restrictions on the internet are likely to increase unless citizens in Russia, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere struggle to keep the internet open. And this struggle requires U.S. support. Authoritarian regimes use a variety of methods to limit online freedom of expression. The United States, therefore, has to respond in multiple ways. This response should consist of, first, preventing the use of U.S. technology in violations of internet users' rights. Second, building effective coalitions among democratic governments in defense of internet freedom. Third is investing in technology to circumvent censorship and strengthen user privacy. And fourth, but certainly not least, supporting indigenous efforts in the countries that are where the internet is restricted, supporting their efforts to expand the space for free expression online. The internet is a medium for communication. Its impact in authoritarian regimes ultimately depends less on the medium itself than on the messages it conveys and on the messengers who use it to drive progress towards democracy. Therefore, we should not only invest in anti-censorship technology, but also support the creation and distribution of pro-democracy content and back the courageous and creative activists in repressive environments who are struggling to bring about political change. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We will now move on to Nathan Freitas, who is adjunct professor at NYU, interactive telecom program, and leading protest software developer. Nathan?
I'll try to walk the walk and use my mobile phone. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing. Senator Brownback, the chairman of the commission. For me, I come as a representative of the countless technology and new media advocates who believe that the most amazing and groundbreaking innovations of our generation should be used for more than the acquisition of wealth or distraction or entertainment, but should be used to really do good in the world. I'm also a longtime member and former board chair of the international group Students for a Free Tibet, working with Laden Tetong and Tenzin Dorji. What I'll share with you today is some of my experiences as an activist practitioner on the ground, employing these technologies both in the US and abroad. A bit of history on Twitter. The roots of this new media technology wave, and specifically Twitter, began in 2004 with an open source web service called TextMob. TextMob was developed by MIT's Institute for Applied Autonomy and used at the 2004 DNC and RNC conventions, specifically at RNC in New York. I was part of a team that utilized this to broadcast tens of thousands of messages to thousands of people on the street to let them know what was going on, what the breaking news was. Later, this same technology was used in the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine and to create flash mobs and coordinate sit-ins. In 2005, two of my colleagues who worked with TextMobs were employed by the company that became Twitter. And they began showing this technology around the office to see the power of short message broadcasting. So Twitter was born out of an activist movement, so it's no surprise that it's come full circle and is being used that way again. My specific area of work is focused on Asia, specifically China, Tibet, and India. I've been employed in Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley, developed patented technology, and was a student at the University of California where I worked on DARPA and NSF-funded research. So, I'm a product of the both government-funded and private-funded efforts to develop new technologies. Now I'm teaching, and fortunate to be teaching at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program, the course titled Social Activism Using Mobile Technology. This is one of the first of its kind courses, and I believe more education opportunities like this should be given to students to understand the alternative opportunities they have coming out of school. My path might seem novel, but it comes from a long history of geeks and nerds and engineers who want to apply their skills to helping their country and their community. During the Second World War and the Cold War, inventors, mathematicians used the first digital computers to play a critical role in the Allies' efforts to stay in front of the Axis. During the Civil Rights Movement, the use of telephones, telegraphs, and traditional social networks in churches and universities created a foundation to mobilize supporters throughout the South. And in recent years, hackers, nerds, and geeks like myself have gravitated towards the social justice, environmental, and human rights movements. So the idea of two guys in a garage in Silicon Valley has translated into teams of activists around the world using Skype, Facebook, and Twitter to innovate and develop new systems to use the same grassroots organizing and nonviolence techniques that have come from Gandhi, but in a new era. We already mentioned Burma, and I believe it will come up. The fascinating thing about what happened in Burma in 2007 was the emergence of the video journalist, this someone with a very cheap digital camera broadcasting their message using the internet, instant messaging, FTP, file transfer, and ending up on the BBC. So the official view, and this is this is sort of the early days of YouTube, and they didn't use that. The idea that they could do that to cover their movement, and even though the revolution, the Saffron Revolution, wasn't successful, the impact they left in the world of activism about the possibility was very successful. A similar model is being used in Iraq through a video channel called Alive in Baghdad, which what that does is represent an alternative option for Iraqis to express themselves in their situation rather than turn to violence. The power of the moving image is unavoidable, and with the low cost of distributing video online, the ability to easily stream it live from mobile phones or satellite data networks means that its reach and impact has come to rival broadcast television. In many cases, authoritarian states' powers prove too formidable for new media technology. We saw this with Tibet in the uprisings last March. The only view that the world had of the uprising was from the Chinese state media. Internet was cut off, phone was cut off. Reporters from around the world were blocked from accessing an area the size of Texas. So in that case, the type of infrastructure that China has been able to put in place is overwhelming. And working with American companies such that they do not provide the technology to censor, filter, surveil, block is an important outcome that I would like to see from these discussions. The other way technology has been used for activism is when outsiders move into a country, activists, human rights workers, fair election advocates, to use technology in a place that allows them to be more efficient. So election monitoring, or for instance, last year during the Beijing Olympics when all protest was not allowed, over 70 activists traveled there with camera phones, small portable computers, high-definition video cameras, and were able to protest and document their work. More on that in my statement in the paper. Finally, last year during the presidential election, I worked on a project called Twitter Vote Report. This was a nationwide Web 2.0 style project for election monitoring that allowed people using SMS, iPhones, or standard telephone in English or Spanish to report in problems that they had at the polling place. We had a real-time Google map, a real-time alerting system for any delays or ballot issues. That was a very successful project that's being replicated in Afghanistan recently and elsewhere. So as you can tell, I'm a very enthusiastic and active participant in the use of new media tools for social good. However, the use of these tools brings serious risk to the user, their friends, family, and broader movement. As a friend of mine said, you cannot Twitter your way out of bludgeoning by security goons. Mobile phones are unique identifiers that track their user. Laptop computers are full of incriminating documents. Digital viruses deliver powerful espionage tools such as GhostNet. One slip and your entire email box and social network can be revealed. So we need to spend more time focusing on protecting activists, protecting these generations that take 20 years to rebuild if they're decimated. And while the free world is enamored of these tools, and we're here at this hearing, our own federal, state, and local law enforcement are often quite fearful of their use at home. So just recently, Elliot Madison, a 41-year-old social worker, was arrested in Pittsburgh and charged with hindering apprehension or prosecution, criminal use of a communication facility, and possession of instruments of crime. He was found with a computer and was using Twitter. This is a contradiction that we must address and come to terms with. We do want to protect our homeland from violent terrorists, and we do want to apply these tools fairly. But we need to make sure that we understand their impact on the domestic front. So there are constructive steps that we can take. We continue to support the freedom of media and extend that to the conduits of the internet and mobile phone of which they operate. We should develop policy and programs that recognize and fund education and the development of new software tools. We should also guide and motivate the corporations, startups, and venture capitalists who build these amazing technologies. I'm happy for tools like Twitter that they can be used just as well to cover the daily lives of Ashton and Demi or break the news of Michael Jackson's death. But the fact that they can be used to broadcast updates from the streets of Iran or spread the news of political prisoners in Tibet being executed is a very weighty obligation and responsibility that they've taken on. So, and lastly, we need to look at embargoes of technology and understand that when we embargo a country, we remove the possibility for the people that need these tools the most to have access to them. Thank you very much, and my full statement's in the paper.
I want to recognize Congressman Bob Adderholtz that has joined us as well. Bob, do you have a comment that you'd like to make?
Thank you, Senator. No, I just want to say it's good to very welcome this hearing today, and glad to be here and to listen to our experts on this issue. It's an issue that certainly is, I think, is the up-and-coming issue of the day. So thank you for having the hearing today, and like I said, I'm very pleased to be here.
Appreciate that. I'm going to have to slip out shortly for another meeting. I think this is a very important issue, and we've got some funding coming forward in the appropriation bills to do some of the things that are being talked about here. But the accumulation of a policy record, I think, would be most helpful from the panel as to what you think it is that we ought to be doing and what we ought to focus on, both in the appropriation process and in the authorization system. And so I welcome the record to be developed and to be able to use that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kyle to run the overall panel.
Thank you very much, Senator, for joining us today. And we will continue with the discussion with Evgeny Morozov, who is Yahoo Fellow at Georgetown University and contributing editor to Foreign Policy Journal. Evgeny?
Hi. I'd like to thank the Commission for convening a hearing on such an important subject. While I share many of the recent enthusiasm about the positive role that new media can play in opening up authoritarian societies, I'm increasingly concerned with both how well some of the societies have themselves managed to adapt to the internet threat and how poorly some of the digital activists, journalists, and even some policymakers understand the risks of trying to promote democracy via the internet. So let me outline some of my most pressing concerns today. First, we have to remember that new media will power all political forces, not just the forces we like. Many of the recent Western funding and media development efforts have been aimed at creating what's known as new digital public spaces, on the assumption that these new digital spaces would enable the nascent actors of civil society to flourish on blogs, Twitter, and social networks. While this does sound reasonable in theory, in practice we have to be prepared that groups that are often anti-democratic, both in their nature and rhetoric, would probably benefit from existence of these spaces as well. So in a sense, promoting these new digital spaces entails similar risks to promoting free elections. It's quite possible we may not like the guys who win. Right? For example, research into the blogospheres in Egypt, Palestine, Russia suggests that these organizations like Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and various groups of Russian nationalists that are making the heaviest use of blogs and social networks, in particular because they are blocked from access to traditional spaces where they could operate. So blind support for promoting blogging and social networking may actually have a lot of negative and unpleasant consequences as well. Second, we have to realize that authoritarian governments themselves have developed extremely sophisticated strategies to control cyberspace, and often those go beyond censorship. It's a mistake to believe that these governments wouldn't be able to manipulate these new public spaces with their own propaganda or use them to their own advantage. Many authoritarian governments are already paying bloggers and internet commentators to spin the political discussions that they do not like. Right? It varies from the Russian approach, where the government is cooperating with several commercial startups, which are creating ideological social networking and blogging sites that support the pro-Kremlin ideology, to the Chinese approach, where the party has created a decentralized network of what's come to be known as 50 Cent Party, which is almost 300,000 people who are being paid to leave comments on sites and blogs that the government doesn't like and just try to spin those discussions. right? Even the Iranian clerics have been running blogging workshops, particularly aimed at controlling religious discourse targeting women. And they've been doing it actually since 2006, much before we began talking about the Twitter revolution. Third, authoritarian governments are increasingly eager to build short-term alliances with digital groups that sometimes share their goals. For example, one of the reasons why Russia has emerged as the most feared player in the field of cyber warfare is because it always acts indirectly, usually by relying on numerous nimble underground gangs of cyber criminals. Most of the time, these gangs perfect the art of stealing credit card details of foreigners, but when the geopolitical pressure so requires, they could be easily mobilized to assist the state. Just think of the recent cyber components to conflicts with Estonia and Georgia, where the communication networks of both countries have been crippled. Arguably, the fact that these networks of criminals who plan and execute these attacks rather than the government actually leaves Kremlin and Moscow more space for maneuver. So we have to remember that. Another example, which I think is equally disturbing, is recent attempts to try to legitimize some of the internet control by involving bloggers and internet personalities themselves. For example, on the suggestion of the Speaker of the upper chamber of the Russian parliament, Kremlin may soon be creating what's known as the bloggers' chamber, which will probably be another one of those state-controlled fake representatives of the civil society that will invite prominent Russian bloggers to set their own standards of what can and cannot be discussed on Russian blogs and on the Russian internet in general. That's probably just another example where the supposed ceding of state power would probably only reinforce the Kremlin's control over the internet. Fourth, we do not fully understand how new media affects civic engagement, and we don't have to pretend that we do. We shouldn't assume that establishing unfettered access to information is going to push people to learn the truth about human rights abuses or other crimes of the governments, and thus make them more likely to become dissidents. Most likely, lifting the censorship lid, at least in the short term, would result in people using this opportunity to fill in other gaps in their information vacuum. Those may have to do with religion, culture, socializing, and so forth, but not necessarily with political dissent. Political activism and active citizenship would probably only come last in this pyramid of cyber needs, if you will. The creators of tools like Siphon and Tor, which do allow anonymized access to the web, often report that many users in authoritarian states actually use those tools to download pornography and access sites which the government doesn't want them to access, not necessarily political ones. In fact, there is a growing risk that, hundreds and thousands of these digital natives in these countries would actually be sucked into this endless cycle of infotainment rather than have their political commitment increase and for political life. Finally, what I should mention is that current U.S. government restrictions on the export of technology to sanctioned countries often actually thwart and impede the adoption of new media technologies. I would like to point out that the current sanctions against governments like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and several others make it significantly difficult for other ordinary citizens, as well as well-established activists and NGOs, to take full advantage of the opportunities that the internet and social media offers. American technology companies face a fairly complicated process of obtaining and renewing licenses and waivers to be able to export their technology to the sanctioned countries. These rules are not 100% clear, and some technology companies decide not to take any risks and withdraw from these markets altogether. For example, some American hosting companies refuse to deal with customers from Zimbabwe or Belarus or Iran altogether. And this inevitably leads to implicit censorship, where activist groups that are actually supported and often recognized by the US government have to justify their activities to web administrators of these companies. I think I would stop here, and you can turn to my full paper. I have 2 more additional points in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Evgeny. We will now move on to Chris Spence, who is Chief Technology Officer at the National Democratic Institute. Chris, your statement.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for this opportunity to comment on the role of new media in authoritarian states. For the last 15 years, NDI has employed technologies as components of many of our democracy-strengthening programs. A wide range of technologies and associated strategies have been used to support activists, political parties, legislatures, women in politics, and civic groups around the world as the partners struggle to strengthen the democratic institutions in their country, increase space for broad participation in political life, and safeguard their elections. In this period, we've been able to see the transformational potential of new technologies applied to democratic development. The new media and mobile technologies that have evolved over the last several years, while in many ways still exploratory in their application to politics, have been put to particularly good use in support of political campaigns and other forms of democratic expression. While the introduction of new media and other technologies should not be seen as a panacea for democratic development, nor a goal in and of itself, these technologies, paired with effective methodologies, can help organizations make significant contributions toward advancing the democratic process in authoritarian states. Democratic development is a long-term commitment and a process, and effective use of technologies by activists, political parties, candidates, civic groups, and others can support and even accelerate the process when the tools are well used. Activists and civic groups have demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt new technologies, and when combined with traditional organizing principles, can create moments of opportunity for democratic gains and enhance channels for political engagement in authoritarian states. The key is not only to employ effective technologies, but to pair the technologies with strategies and approaches that are developed for the political environment in which the technologies are being used. This approach can help activists get out ahead of authoritarian regimes and make relative gains and even game-changing democratic gains when periods are identified where such innovations can rapidly be put to use. While regimes may quickly catch up or clamp down by employing technologies and other techniques to bolster their regimes, gains made during the gap between early adoption and governmental response can have long-term positive consequences for democratic activists. The strengths of the early uses of new media for activism have been in communication and in sharing information about political developments. However, thus far, we would argue that the tools have been less effectively utilized for the organizing required that can lead to constructive political outcomes. In some situations, information has been produced by citizens using innovative new media tools that initiates a process of change, but the process is stalled due to a lack of the organizations or institutions in the country required to capture the interests and channel the process toward purposeful, strategic, and peaceful direct action. Assisting organizations in these countries to build this capacity is an important component in leveraging the new media tools toward political reform. For example, those that followed the Iran election on Twitter may have felt frustration as a fantastic amount of information was captured and posted on the internet during the election protests. But the pro-reform political organization and institutions in the country were limited in their ability to channel the information and the energy of the crowds into a process that led to a reform-based outcome. One of the institutions that are particularly well suited to this role, but often overlooked, sorry, I like that.
That'll pass.
How many is that done?
Something to do with voting in the House.
Great.
Yeah, please continue.
One set of institutions that are particularly well suited to this role, but are often overlooked in international circles, are political parties. Relatively little attention is paid to the important role that parties play in aggregating citizen interests and channeling them into constructive and peaceful means toward democratic reform. One area of opportunity with tremendous potential in countries where NDI works is to provide more new media technology assistance to political parties, especially in autocratic states, where the regime often has access to considerable state resources and controls the organs of state communication. NDI's work with domestic election monitoring groups provides an illustrative example of combining these new technologies with effective methodologies and strong organizations toward impactful political purposes. A common approach to domestic election observing involves deploying citizen election observers with their mobile phones to a representative sample of polling stations around a country on election day. These observers are trained to identify election irregularities or record observations and results. The observers transfer information from paper reporting forms to a centralized national database via text message or voice message, and the information is then aggregated and analyzed by the organizational leadership to make an assessment of the overall quality of the process or accuracy of the election result, and then this information is shared with the public. This approach is a way to collect substantial evidence to detect and deter fraud while building public trust in the process and adding legitimacy to the election if things go well. The uses of these new media tools and related election activities have been very effective for our partners. Due to the rapid and accurate reporting provided by the tools and the data-driven analysis, this methodology has professionalized the way civic groups use quantitative election information in real time on Election Day, and has been central to the ability of NDI partners to give the public a nonpartisan view on the quality of the election process in their country. In many cases, we believe our partners have made contributions that have prevented post-election violence or identified and raised important concerns with the electoral process that have led to more democratic and peaceful outcomes. The field of domestic election monitoring has improved significantly in the last several years, partly due to improved methods and strategies, and certainly enabled by these new technologies, and replicated by the role of international organizations. Citizen reporting is another method by which citizens have been able to communicate various aspects of their election day experiences using new media tools, usually text messages and tweets. The information reported by citizens is typically collected and made accessible to the public on a website or online map in raw form. The value of this approach is to increase citizen participation in the election process. But to date, the challenge has been putting the information to good use. Tools are being developed to evaluate the authenticity and filter these incoming information so that organizations can then be prepared to put this powerful crowdsourcing methodology to work during election periods. However, even as the tools and methods improve, citizen reporting promises to be a useful tool towards some electoral goals, but won't be a substitute for election monitoring in situations where assessing the overall legitimacy of an election is required. The last component of success for activists struggling for democratic reform involves the political environment in which they live and conduct their work. The challenges faced by activists in autocratic nations are immense, and these challenges are not only technical in nature, but also legal and political. Authoritarian regimes typically put in place legal mechanisms such as laws that not only limit the activities of international and domestic NGOs and political parties, but also subversion and libel laws against citizens who try to express their views and opinions online or publicly. Laws against intermediaries of communication, such as ISPs and telecommunications providers, and legalized surveillance of citizens, including their online activity, and a wide range of technologies that they use to enforce these legal tools, including the internet filtering and surveillance technologies that we'll be discussing today. The international community can help to create a more enabling environment for activists to utilize new media and tools in pursuit of democratic reform by implementing programs that foster greater access and affordability to technologies, that seek more openness of these regimes, that advocate for increased freedom of expression, and that protect the rights of privacy of citizens in these countries. So to conclude and summarize, windows of opportunities for political reform can be created by the use of new media in authoritarian states with a combination of good technology tools, effective strategies and methodologies, put into use by organizations or institutions that can channel the energy of the public and the information they produce toward constructive and peaceful political activities. The political environment provides the playing field under which all of this occurs, and we all have a role to play in creating an enabling environment which activists and groups seeking democracy reform can work to build democratic societies without fear using new media tools. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Thank you, Chris. We will now proceed to Joe Shoyu, Deputy Director of the Global Internet Freedom Consortium, for your statement.
Thank you. So the internet is a fast, and also an inexpensive way to access information and to communicate. While authorities in closed societies can easily shut down newspapers, block TV channels, jam shortwave radios, and ban books, the internet is far more elusive. It has become the greatest hope for global information freedom and democratization, and for peaceful progress of the sort the Helsinki process made possible. On the flip side, however, the internet has also become the biggest target of information censorship for all repressive governments, who have put tremendous resources into beefing up their cyber war systems over the past decade. The internet censorship firewalls have become the 21st century Berlin walls that separate our world. Amid the darkness of the internet censorship in closed societies, a thread of light still remains. It is the internet lifelines offered by the anti-censorship systems, like that of the Global Internet Freedom Consortium, GIF for short, which has been providing millions in closed societies for free access to the internet for years. GIF consists of a small team of dedicated Chinese-American engineers who were brought together by our common practice of Falun Gong. Many of us were also among the students on Tiananmen Square during the 1989 massacre. Through the events of the Tiananmen massacre and the Falun Gong suppression, we have personally experienced how frightening the state-controlled media can be. It confounds right with wrong overnight, inciting hatred in the society to pave the way for oppression. It is our firm belief that free flow of information is the most effective and powerful way to peacefully transform a closed society and promote human rights and civil liberties. This conviction has driven us to spend countless sleepless nights contending with tens of thousands of internet monitors and censors in China and around the world so that the citizens inside those repressed countries may safely communicate with each other and with the world. The men and women of GIF maintain operations out of our own pockets, but we provide our products and services to the citizens of closed societies entirely free of charge. After years of hard work, our anti-censorship system has attained global reach. It is used by people from almost every closed societies in the world and has been supporting the largest user bases in the world's most censored countries like China, Iran, and Burma. During the Saffron Revolution in Burma in late August 2007, we experienced a threefold increase in average daily traffic from Burma. Many Burmese use our system to post photos and videos of the crackdown to the outside blogs and websites. The Burmese government had to entirely shut down the internet to stop the outflow of information about the oppression. Before the Beijing Olympics, when uprisings in Tibet led to thousands of arrests and large-scale human rights abuses, we saw our traffic from the region increased by over 400% in the first few days. Perhaps the best example of the role of GIF software was during the Iranian election this past June, when our traffic from Iran increased by nearly 600% in 1 week. On the Saturday of June the 20th, an estimated over 1 million Iranians used our system to visit previously censored websites such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Google. The Iranian users posted videos, photos, and messages about the bloody crackdown. GIF systems have also been of benefit to US-based organizations such as Human Rights in China, Voice of America, and Radio Free Asia, and even companies like Google and Yahoo who self-censor, since we bring the uncensored version of their services to closed societies. In fact, when the US internet companies are criticized for complying with the censorship demands of dictatorships, they often claim that they have few options but to do so. However, powerful anti-censorship systems make it effectively impossible for the regimes to demand censorship of those companies' in-country sites. This is because the more in-country sites are compromised by censorship demands, the more likely people in those countries will be to ignore them and to hook up to the uncensored overseas sites through anti-censorship systems. The services GIF provides are invaluable, and the impact goes far beyond the internet. When the people in closed societies gain a taste of freedom and are given a way to share information, they will no longer acquiesce to tyranny and injustice. Internet freedom has the potential of transforming the closed societies in a peaceful but powerful way that must not be underestimated. The operation of our system is very efficient. It only needs a few dollars to support a user in closed societies for an entire year. Moreover, for every dollar we spend, China and other censors will need to spend hundreds, perhaps thousands of dollars to block us. The information warfare over the internet has now boiled down to the battle of resources. We have the technology and the commitment. With a modest amount of resources, there is capacity to tear down the 21st century Berlin walls. When Congress passed the Internet Freedom Provision in the fiscal year 2008 Appropriation Act, it declared that, quote, ensuring the freedom of Internet communication in dictatorships and autocracies throughout the world is a high and critical national interest priority of the United States, end quote. Thanks to this hearing and the bipartisan efforts now being made in Congress, I hope that the time has now come for the United States to make that priority come alive in committed and robust fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We have one more panelist who actually could not be with us physically today, Oleg Brega, who is a prominent Moldovan blogger who was actively involved in the post-election coverage and protests and demonstrations that took place in Chisinau. We do have, I believe, his written statement here available for the audience as well, currently on our website, as well as our YouTube channel, which is just, I guess you go to YouTube/Helsinki Commission, all one word. You should be able to find Mr. Brega's presentation there that he did prepare for today's hearing. And I would like to specifically thank Vlad Spinu and the Moldova Foundation for helping us out with that. We would love to have been able to telecom him in or teleconference him in, but due to some logistical issues, we weren't able to do that. With that, I'd like to thank the entire panel for your excellent statements and also for keeping to time. We now have a fair amount of time for questions, which I like to think, are really the best part of these types of discussions. And again, we don't need to limit, the panelists can question other panelists or disagree, and certainly people from the audience. The only thing I would like to ask is if you could just keep your remarks in the form of a question and identify yourself. We do have a makeshift station over there, microphone, and it is, although we probably can all hear, it's helpful if you do speak into the microphone for the benefit of the transcribers who will transcribe your question for the written record of today's event. So with that, first to the audience. And we probably will take a few at a time and then let the panelists respond as appropriate. So, sir, yeah, if you wouldn't mind stepping up to the mic, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 to get it started and let the panel respond.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Demi. I'm from the State Department, and I'd like to thank the panel for holding this briefing today. My question was directed particularly at Mr. Spence, but any of you feel free, please, to answer it. I had the opportunity to observe the Moldovan elections earlier this year, and it was my first observation mission, so I learned a lot. But one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of the atrocities that would sort of make an election unfree or unfair sort of occurred in the months leading up to the elections. And I really liked the idea of using citizen observers and giving them the tools and technology to sort of go out there and report things on election day. But and I know that the missions do go out there and observe any sort of foul play beforehand. But is there planning to do any activities or any ongoing activities right now to sort of utilize the same sort of strategy before the elections? Because I know a lot of the stuff doesn't get caught on election day. Thank you.
Do we have another question or two to sort of load the panel up here? Sure.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ben Bain. I'm a reporter with Federal Computer Week magazine. I was curious how important it is to avoid the appearance of interference. It was brought up a couple times on the panel, but particularly with Iran, I mean, there was a lot of back and forth into what the appropriate role for the State Department was to play in interaction with Twitter and some of these other services. And I'm just curious about the take on how you avoid some of the some of those concerns, and if it's important to in the first place. Thanks.
One more.
My name is Robert Guerra. I'm the director, or the project director of Freedom House's Global Internet Freedom Program. I have a question. There's the issue of measures and what specifically can be done, both from a technological point of view, but also non-technological human resource could be done. So there was a specific comments on changes in legislation or others, or hosting providers in the U.S. It'd be good to have a bit more details that were mentioned, but also the non-technical aspects that help supplement opening up the internet that could be useful to address the human skills that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, please, maybe we can just start, I guess, from this side to that side, left to right or right to left, however you're looking at it. Please, Daniel.
Right. Let me, I mean, in answer to the first question, how to gather information on pre-election violations. I mean, I think, Chris made a very important point that it's not just the technology, but it has to be part of a larger strategy. And I think the same goes whether you use it for election monitoring or anything else. And so, you know, in principle, the same kind of technology that was used to get citizen input on election day can certainly be used in a pre-election period, provided you have the systems in place and especially the people know about this opportunity and feed it in. And there's a very critical component also mentioned by Chris, but often overlooked in these kind of programs. The information needs to be verified. It is useless or even counterproductive to simply be passing around rumors, and rumor mongering is very big in elections and especially election day. So it's important as part of the structure that you have qualified people to sort through the information and call what is credible reporting from citizens from, you know, very unsubstantiated information. In terms of the question about avoiding the appearance of interfering, the question on Iran, you know, a lot has been said about the U.S. role. I mean, I think one of the most significant roles of the outside world is actually the diaspora community of Iranians, that a lot of the information got out via sort of personal networks to Iranians outside the country. There were, you know, photographs from the days immediately following the election of, you know, Basij beating up student protesters and the like, that, you know, might have been posted or passed around among a few people inside Iran, but they really only got broad exposure because Iranians inside the country had friends or family outside who then would post that material on YouTube or elsewhere to get it broad exposure. So, and you know, the Shuj mentioned the importance of the anti-censorship technology. I mean, it was obviously critical that that technology was available and, in fact, in wide use within Iran, so that you know, there were, even though there were significant blocks on the internet immediately following the June 12 elections, enough Iranians knew how to get around that to get the information out.
Thanks. Oh, please, yeah. And if you don't, if any of the panelists don't have anything to say on a particular question, we can just move on. Just helps us everybody have a shot.
I'll be terse. Regarding election monitoring, I want to just call out the Ushahidi, USHADIHI. It's a crisis mapping platform that has grown out of the movement in Africa coming out after the Kenyan elections. It's akin to a blog system, but for mapping crisis. And what's unique about it is it allows you to capture unverified and verified information. So it starts to realize that just because something is tweeted, it's not true, and there's sort of posturing and deception. When we build systems that say, okay, that is a type of data we'll have, let's figure out how to deal with it, you get something better. And what's interesting, I think we've seen the first round, the 1.0 of a lot of this election monitoring. As these systems come in place, they'll be running all the time. And they'll be used in local elections and in state-level elections. And the movement for, you know, these tools will be easier, just like blogs. Everyone blogs. A few years, everyone's got their own crisis mapping platform. I think in terms of avoiding interference, you know, the role of groups developing amazing proxy software, independent activist groups, technologists, universities. These are groups that can kind of act without, you know, the national players getting involved, and that's the world I'm in. And you know, in terms of the State Department asking Twitter to not turn their servers off, that's a very interesting position. That where does it end? You know, do they keep asking more? Can they change their SSL port so that Gmail is now accessible? Do you just keep doing these things? I'm not sure. And finally, in terms of you know, what to do, and I'll just give one example that I brought up in my opening statement. I think in the university system in the U.S., we need to have more opportunities to educate students that they can have a career in using technology to support a variety of causes and not just focus on Wall Street or going to work at Google. So I'm working on that, and I hope some of you will as well.
I think the interference question is actually a very serious issue. And I think there is more and more realization by many authoritarian leaders that there is a sustained effort by the US government and Western European governments and the foundations to try to undermine democracy via the internet. Whether that effort actually is being made or not is a secondary issue. And I think whatever the US government and its agencies can do to minimize that perception would actually be extremely useful. So from that perspective, I think that reaching out to Twitter was the most terrible thing that the State Department could have done at that point, in part because it did confirm the thesis of the Iranian authorities that Twitter is being used as a platform for fomenting the next revolution. And I think if these things are done, at least it could at least be done privately. But even beyond that, I think we see now, looking at the trials happening in Tehran, that the authorities do perceive the information technology as a threat. Whether it is actually a threat or not doesn't really matter. They do think that Twitter and Facebook, and if you saw the trial of Kian, in the article in the New York Times yesterday, even the membership on a mailing list is already possibly, an implication in being some sort of a spy network. So I think we do have to do a lot to minimize any kind of perception of interference. On the question of what's to be done, looking broader than just what kind of laws we can pass and what we can do with companies, I think there is still an assumption that we have to go and start funding the creation of new digital networks and new websites and new blogs, and there is all of the media development has to change and to sort of target outputs and products in the new media sector. And as someone who has worked for a new media NGO trying to do some of that and who has advised some of the foundations on this, I can tell you that it doesn't really work that way in new media development the way it works in old media development. You can't just go fund a project, wait for 2 or 3 years, and expect that it will either work or not, because in most of those projects, whether it's going to work or not in 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months. So what happens is that because of all these bureaucratic models that we have, we keep waiting for 2 or 3 years. In the meantime, all the people who could have been working on their own entrepreneurial projects lose any kind of entrepreneurial drive because they're all doing it either for the government or the government-funded NGOs, in those countries. So my advice would be to actually focus on creating networks of people and, focusing on funding conferences, exchanges, getting people out of, Belarus or, Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan and hooking them up with bloggers and, the Baltics or Central Eastern Europe, and then expecting them to go and create something rather than just giving them, a check and expect them to come up with the next Twitter, because it's not realistic that that's going to happen.
Okay, I'll address a little bit of the election monitoring in the Moldova question to the best that I can. In terms of Moldova in the July snap elections, I know that NDI was working with NMO, a regional international election monitoring group, and a domestic group. We had some problems, and NMO was harassed and kicked out of the country, and the NDI program largely shut down. At that point, although we've seen a lot of positive changes in Moldova since then, I don't have any information on our current program for any. I know that there was almost a presidential election this week, and that that situation's a little bit fluid. And I don't have any information on our future programming in Moldova, although I'm sure I would anticipate that we would support our domestic partners in very similar ways. In terms of addressing the long-term observing piece of that question, NDI often, and it's very, very common for domestic partners to conduct long-term observing, which is in the election period leading up to the election. It isn't usually what makes the headlines on election day when we're making our statements, but almost always either whether we do an election day observation or a long-term observation or both, we always do our best to capture what happened in the pre-election period as part of our political statements about improving the process and coaching our partners on how to really take a look at that and include that in any statements that are made. So pre-election period is very, very important, and whether we program around it or not and have the opportunity to work with partners in that period, it's something that's always considered. Media monitoring and other techniques are used to sort of to track of election irregularities in the pre-election period. In terms of the bigger question about election monitoring and the quality of data, one thing that I would say as a broad point, and I mentioned it briefly in the talk, is that the professionalization of civic groups in their election monitoring has really amplified and magnified in the last 3 or 4 years, and we attribute that to these tools. Monitoring groups, and this kind of gets to the threshold questions about Ushahidi and some of the platforms where you're getting a lot of interesting information from citizens, but at the end of the day, you've really got to decide, have thresholds been reached which call into question the legitimacy of the process? And that's really the political question that election observers and the groups that we work with have to grapple with. And there's so much involved in that methodology that one of the concerns about the crisis mapping or the crowdsourcing is that the public can then draw interpretations about the outcome of elections without necessarily having the filter required. You could look at a map of some city and see 4 or 5 or 10 or several violations of election law reported by citizens who, you have to deal with the verification problem. But is that significant in the big picture? If there's 110,000 polling stations in a country, and you have a sort of a random grouping of reports, it's really dangerous to draw. It's a skill area to draw conclusions about what conclusions can be drawn from irregularities that are reported. And so the observation process is a science and the method of drawing those conclusions. And so it's really important that as these tech tools get better, and we like the tools, Ushahidi and the other platforms are great, but we need to make a distinction between, what can be expected out of a professional monitoring exercise and what can be drawn from unsolicited, inputs from citizens. And I think there are good things that can be taken from both. I'll leave it there, I guess.
Yeah, I just like to make one comment about this interference issue. So I guess it's mostly because of the State Department comments on Twitter's. And I agree with Daniel that we should make the technologies available for the people in the closed societies. Whether we need to make that comment or not, that's a different issue. Because I'm from one of such countries, so we understand the pain, of the people in those societies, and they are very hungry for free information. Just take this Iranian election as an example. So the traffic coming from Iran on June the 20th was so large, and it soon consumes all of resources and crashed our servers. So we had to shut down the servers for maintenance, for cleaning for a few hours, and we got so many messages and even phone calls from there. And so when we restore the services, we somehow have to restrict the Iranian services, because otherwise our server just cannot take that kind of traffic. By accident, we curbed some of the video services because that consumes more bandwidth. And in particular, we stopped the YouTube services, and we got so much complaint from Iran, and people even make calls to ask for YouTube, so we soon restore that. So from this, we can see, that once we have this kind of tools available for the people, they will find and use it. We didn't do any promotion to Iran at all because, we are a Chinese group. Mostly we do Chinese websites and services. but they found services by themselves, and there are millions of users in Iran using the service. So I think for a peaceful change in the closed societies, if we have the technologies available, whether it's Twitter, Google, Facebook, plus the anti-censorship systems, the people will pick them up, and that will be good for the society there.
Thank you. Mike is up there.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. My name is Matt Browner-Hamlin. I also serve on the board of Students for a Free Tibet, formerly with Nathan. My question is, going off of both the discussion of interference and dovetailing off of the third question about what can actually be done, I think the question of interference cuts both ways in that, well, I think there's very clear consensus about how states should relate to technology in closed states. There isn't the same degree of consensus on how corporations, technology companies in countries like the US can behave with authoritarian states. And obviously companies like Google, Cisco, Microsoft, and Yahoo come to mind in the case of China, but there are many other less prominent examples that are probably even more pervasive in terms of the impact of speech within a closed society. So I wonder what can be done specifically in the U.S. relating to the behavior of American technology companies towards authoritarian states and their products. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi, I'm a program officer at the Academy for Educational Development, and I've been managing civil society programs in Moldova now going into the third year.
What is your name?
Kristen Farthing.
Thank you.
And my question is related to, I was very excited by the events in April and then continuing to the summer with the re-election in August. And my question is how, as a development professional managing programs, how can you channel that energy and sustain the protest in a way that then becomes, concerted political action by youth?
Thank you. Please, we'll take one more and then we'll take two more if we have them. And then we'll.
Hi, my name is Mark Belinsky with Digital Democracy. There's a sort of lumping of tools as under one sort of big header, this new media tools, but each tool is different, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, and the responsibility that each tool sort of takes under themselves for the security and privacy of their users is also different in each specific case. I'm curious if there are tools or methods that you would encourage, whether open source or otherwise, that we really start to focus on contra other tools that might be good for social networking, but particularly under authoritarian regimes can be really dangerous because it doesn't protect individual users.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Will DeCurno. I'm with the State Department. I guess my question builds off of the second question here. You mentioned how important it is to couple, the impact of these new technologies with the institutions, the political parties that are needed to make that into real change. And I'd really just like to hear any ideas any of the panelists have about how you can do that, given especially, I feel the room to operate for information technology is often much greater than to deal with political organizations and things that, the regimes are more afraid of than the technology itself, and how the panelists feel you may reconcile that gap.
Thank you. With that, we have certainly to begin responding. And why don't we start from this side with Joe, if you would like to respond first.
So I would just make a comment on the third question about the open source and security issue. So this, for Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, this kind of services, it's very different from the anti-censorship services. But those services, they're basically a kind of service provided, for whether it's in the closed society or even in the free society, to use for public use. So for that, of course, there are a privacy issue, there are a security issue, others, but it's not as acute.
as for anti-censorship technologies. For anti-censorship technologies, we are basically being attacked, traced, and reverse engineered, studied extensively, fiercely, by the censors. So the user safety is the biggest priority of ours. So for that, and also we have to penetrate the firewall. We have to enable the users to pass through the firewall censorship safely. And so for that, it's proven that there are certain technologies that do not work well and has potential big problems. We do not want to address the details of the technology here, but we do have such issues. But for the technology like ours, for example, it's been working quite well because, if we can protect the people, especially those dissidents in China, pretty much we can protect everybody in the world. But that does need a lot of work, so it's not an easy job.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. The question about how to channel the energy. How do you, what are the strategies and methods that are used to take the information that's coming out of these new media tools and put it to productive use? And I think that there's a whole lot of ways to get at this. And one thing I would say generally is that it's political environment contextual. So you have to sort of build the solutions based on the political environment you're working in, the relationships in the country, the politics of the country, and some of these other constraints around security and safety of your partners. One of the tried and true ways that we do it at NDI is work through NGOs and political parties that are reputable, that have the public trust of the society, of the citizens, so that as the information comes through these channels, it can be looked at, it can be reviewed, it can be analyzed, and then somebody can get on television or get on the web or get wherever they need to get to and say things that are useful and practical for the citizens to sort of act upon. And the idea here is, in a lot of situations for us, it's please try to form your statements in ways that prevent violence, that talk about using legal channels to vent your frustrations. There's often a judicial or some kind of adjudication process. And really, in these activist environments, it's really important that the message is identify the legal channels, use them, use partners that people can identify with and trust, so that they can take the lead from those kind of partners. If you look at what the Obama campaign did, there's all kinds of strategies that you can look at depending on the environment, and books are being written on all of those that were relevant to the U.S. political scene. But generally speaking, it's context specific, and it's really not. It doesn't have to be rocket science. Just get people who understand the environment to design the programs. In terms of tools, the ones that NDI partners use are the ones we're talking about. Skype is huge. Skype is really important technology. I don't know if it sort of meets the threshold of new media, but it's very important. It's relatively secure, and it's easy to use, and it's cheap or free. Some of the Tor and the GFI technologies and all of these onion routing type things are important. I don't know how much. I don't have a firsthand knowledge of how much our partners use those. I think they are important in some countries, and certainly used widely utilized, especially in these mass movements. And then of course Facebook and Twitter. And so the strategies differ from tool to tool, but I think those are the ones that I would say we think about and we see people using. And I think I addressed the two questions. Was there? I guess I'll call it quits. Did I address your question?
More or less, it was similar to the. I was just interested, really, like what happens when a country, lets outsiders come in and increase access to technology, but doesn't allow anyone to, interfere
But yeah. Well, I guess we're talking about the tools and then strategies around that. I guess what I would say is that whenever activists are in these countries and they're getting ready to think about decisions about using these tools and their own personal safety is at risk, what NDI would do is to our best of our ability coach on on the parameters of the tools and how they might be used and what the risks are. And then everybody's going to have to make a personal decision about how they're going to use the tool. In a lot of ways, the internet tools that we're talking about are black boxes to a lot of people. You know, they don't know if I've got this image on a phone or I got this video on my phone. What am I going to do now? I have a decision to make. Is it safe for me to transfer it? Is it safe for me to put it up on YouTube? How am I connecting to the internet? All those decisions have to be made at a very personal level, and I think that's one part of the discussion that gets a little bit missed when you think about these people using these tools. Is it's easy for us to sit around and talk about using the tools, but if you're in that position where you can see the riot police coming at you, you can see the stones, and you make those decisions as an activist. But if you have to sort of deal with the technology and it's a bit of a black box, those decisions are hard. And I think that activists around the world will have to have to deal with that challenge.
I think I'll tackle the question about companies, investment companies more specifically first. I think we tend to lump different corporate activities together here. I mean, first you do have companies which provide technology for monitoring of traffic and surveillance, right, and censorship. And then you have companies who provide basic services like email or social networking, and under pressure may actually disclose the personal details of their users. And I think we should distinguish between the two, because it's important to understand that, the second category, provision of services, if we antagonize or, sort of push Western companies from this field to this market, their places will be quickly taken by the local companies, who often are much easier to manipulate and actually pressure into releasing all sorts of personal details. So while we may think that, Google Mail or Yahoo Mail are terrible and these companies may be complicit with the government, I'm not sure that they are that worse ethically than the majority of web companies in China, who would probably often do that without even disclosing it to the media, right? So we have to make sure that we do not necessarily, push the Western companies out and, ensure that the locals take their place, because they would probably be much easier to manipulate. And if you look at censorship on Chinese blogs, Chinese web platforms are, increasingly very eager to self-censor. I mean, research by Rebecca McKinnon last year showed that, when she went and created controversial content on, dozens of Chinese blog platforms, her content disappeared within, 24 hours from most of them, right? And it's considered normal, right, by their standards. If you had that page pulled from Blogspot or, MySpace, it would probably be a scandal, right, of international proportions. That said, the first category, the companies which do provide technology for filtering and surveillance, I think they would be much harder to replace yet by domestic competition, right, because some of that technology is fairly sophisticated. Even though if you look at how the Chinese try to implement the Green Dam software, right, the Green Dam censorship, whatever, package that would limit what you can do on your computer, you actually see that they did steal some of the technology, apparently, from the Western companies. So I do think that even if we try to limit what the Western companies are doing, you'll still have some of that knowledge already out there, and the locals, particularly paid or funded by the government, will build on that. But that said, I think the crucial question here is transparency, and it's a question of whether we have to do it through some legal norms by requiring companies that do export any sort of technology to these countries to disclose exactly what it is. At this point, I'm still not sure whether Nokia Siemens is supplying any deep packet inspection technology to Iran, despite probably a dozen press releases from them, right? And I do think we have to achieve a standard at which we do actually know what's going on, and then, I expect expect civil society and NGOs will actually step in and try to mobilize, boycotts or protests, just like they do against other corporations who engage in unethical practices abroad. So I think I'll just.
I would like to actually point out that there were domestic versions of Twitter that were created in China that actually haven't lasted, and now they've been shut down entirely. So there are some strange cases where this does happen, where someone says, oh, we'll make the Chinese Twitter, and then maybe you can't even censor it, it just gets completely turned off. I think there's another class of technology that has emerged, which is a sort of a camera surveillance technology, which what's interesting about that is it's sort of globally accepted in this, war on terror. I live in New York downtown, and I understand why we want surveillance cameras. I understand why London wants surveillance cameras. When authoritarian regimes get the power of surveillance cameras and they can decide who are domestic terrorists, Tibetans are terrorists, the Uyghurs are terrorists, the power of that is scary. And Naomi Klein wrote a great article looking at Shenzhen and Lhasa and some of the areas in China with surveillance camera and image recognition and things like that. In terms of channeling energy, I think a lot of my work is looking at connecting nonviolence practice with new technology. And I think about, how do I know who Lech Walesa was? And thinking that, he was the guy that said, let's not charge down and, take to the streets. Let's sit in this factory and work the phones and work the media and the press and use these communication tools to get our story out. And that kind of thought process, and in the new media age, needs to be encouraged. So looking at, again, something like the Alive in Baghdad or numerous other projects that use social media tools to create citizen journalists out of people that might otherwise be frustrated, rioters, so to speak. So I would call to the news media organizations to look at working with local citizen journalists on the ground instead of sending in your correspondent, your embedded correspondent. Finally, Skype is a great tool, and it's an interesting trend in telephony, which our phones are becoming more and more virtual. Google Voice is the latest craze. The phone system is becoming this very malleable open source thing where, in some work I've done, I've set up banks and banks and banks of virtual phone numbers that all go to the same line, so that you can't trace the person by the phone number that they call. And you can have 100 new phone numbers a day, right? There's things you can do with phones that are amazing, that are what we think of the web, we're going to start thinking of with the telephone. So keep an eye on that.
I'd like to add some comments on the question about U.S. companies. Obviously, there are efforts through the Global Network Initiative for the companies to raise their own standards on human rights issues and in collaboration with human rights organizations. And my sense is that will only take them so far. And part of the problem, even in that initiative, is that it's currently limited to 3 companies. And it doesn't include Web 2.0 companies, and it doesn't include any foreign companies. And I think if there's going to be, if there discussion about raising the human rights standards of companies, we should not just be looking at U.S., but also European, Japanese, other companies working or based in democratic countries. Obviously, I take Evgeny's distinction, I think, is very good between the, those who are providing basic services and can be more easily replaced by local companies in China or elsewhere versus those who are developing technology. I think we need to do a lot more regarding the companies that produce censorship and surveillance technology. And, the Nokia Siemens case, obviously more information is needed, but it looks pretty clear that they exported a surveillance system which would be pretty standard in any country, but the fact that it is in Iran strongly implies that it's used to track down peaceful dissidents. Similarly, there are indications, not enough research, but strong indications that a lot of the censorship technology used in the Middle East is basic sort of net nanny software that is used in the U.S. and elsewhere. And again, you can use it in the U.S. where we have legal safeguards and court systems and protections for individuals. If you take that into countries where you don't have rule of law, chances are pretty good it's going to be used to censor political content and criticism of the government and the kind of free speech that we ought to encourage. And so I think this is an issue that really requires some government action.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, Erica Murat from Voice of America Russian Service, and I have one question to whoever wants to answer and one to Evgeny Morozov. First question, I'm going to use the buzzword terrorists, but this also includes criminals and whatever organized criminal groups. To what extent can they use those open sources? Because I mean, you know, Osama bin Laden can't have a Twitter because obviously he's going to be tracked. And my second question is to Evgeny Morozov. Russia has invented Google search engine. Allegedly for kids, but it does really filter what information you can search. Do you see it as one of the tools to censor internet, or is just another search engine? Thank you.
Go ahead. I can start with the second question. I mean, those efforts are pretty common, particularly in Western Europe now, where there is a strong push to make the internet safe for kids and to make sure that it's safe from child pornography. And I think the bigger problem that I see with this current rhetoric that we need to start, blocking access to these websites is that people who really want to access them still access them, because what's happening is that we are not eliminating the content. We are not going after the actual sites. We are just preventing access to them. So the content is still there. If you're really smart, you can actually figure out how to access them. But what I see as the downside here is that you get more and more countries, Russia and China included, who point to the West and say that, look, guys, you are having your own campaigns to limit freedoms online, whether it's because of child pornography or something else. Why aren't we allowed to do the same in the field of, in the same field or maybe in the field of politics? If you look at, there was a crackdown on pornography earlier this year in China, where, they blocked several thousand websites, right? And at least several of them were not exactly clear-cut cases of pornography. You could actually make a case that some of them were just sites which write about culture and often write about sensitive problems, for the country. And the fact that now we see more and more crackdowns like this, or often this rhetoric of let's keep the children free, is a little bit terrifying. And I think at truth, it's not very effective because the real criminals are still using those networks. And to your first question about terrorists and and who else is using the web, I mean, it does make sense for any group which wants to remain invisible or unseen and which doesn't have any resources to organize and mobilize to use the web first to communicate and then to do outreach. So of course it's happening, but the question is, how do you define terrorists first, right? And then exactly, are they going to be more powerful than people fighting for freedom? And here, it's not a question of technology, it's a question of politics and social forces. So, I don't think we should stop promoting these tools simply because terrorists are going to use them, because, that would seem to be counterproductive.
I get asked this question a lot as well because I'm building like an encrypted phone, and people are like, oh man, Mafia's gonna love that, or something. And so it is, and my students ask me this as well, and I don't, from an engineer perspective, I don't want to be the guy that said, yeah, I made the AK-47, and it's a great gun. So you have to be careful. You need to inject morality into these things, but you do it's a slippery slope. So I think ultimately the use of tools for positive gains outweighs them for criminal. And criminals already have plenty of tools at their disposal for corruption and money laundering and things. So.
Any other questions? Neil? Please, Neil. Neil Simon with the...
I'm sorry, should I go to my...
Sure.
I'm Neil Simon. I am the communications director for the commission, but I want to follow up on that question with looking at who is more developed right now in the use of this technology, and we've seen a lot of great examples of civil society, but are terrorists and other negative groups more advanced in some countries than even civil society and activists? And we see this in, border drug wars and whatnot. We always see people getting a step ahead of law enforcement. Do we see the other side getting a step ahead of activists?
I can answer it quickly. The problem is that we never see the most successful acts of either activism or terrorism online, because if you really want to be effective, the last thing you want to do is to publicize your networks. And that's why I've been somewhat skeptical of the ability of Twitter and Facebook to be very useful in planning and organizing a revolution, because those platforms by default are open to anyone. They're open to anyone to watch. And probably they can be very useful in publicizing what has already been planned, but they're extremely visible. And there are a lot of people on both sides who actually would want to watch them. So I think we, in analysts of this technology, are always one step behind, because the moment technology attracts attention and becomes public, it stops being useful, right, for people who are actually using it. There was an interesting, I'll give you an interesting example. Iranian activists used to conceal and hide their political discussions on a social networking site for book lovers called Goodreads, right? And that's a fairly, a lot of people use it for purposes that have nothing to do with Iran politics, and that was the whole point, that you can actually carve out a little space on that site and actually carry on with discussions, and, people sitting in Iranian secret services would never guess that these discussions are going on. The moment Los Angeles Times published an article about it, I'm sure it stopped being useful, right? So they had to move on somewhere else. So, and that's the tension that I have, for example, always as an analyst. Even if you know that these tools are being used, to what extent can you disclose that they are actually being successful? So it's very hard to answer that in short.
Please, sure.
On this terrorist issue, because I've been asked the similar questions many times. So there is a difference between anonymization tools, which I believe some of us mentioned, and also anti-censorship tools. There is a difference between these two concepts. Anonymization tools, I would say, let's not be so absolute, but almost all the other tools except ours are anonymization tools. And they are used for mostly communications that hide the user's or user's identity. Okay? And they cannot be used with targeted blockage by the censors. So in other words, if a censor wants to target this tool, block it, and try to trace, break the security, and there is a potential danger for them to succeed. Anti-censorship tool is to use in the environment, hostile environment that is targeted by the censors. So they know your tool, and they know where your proxies are, and try to block you. And so in other words, it's used for massive effort to bring down the firewall. And the other tools are mostly for private use and small-scale use. It's unscalable in a lot of senses. And for those kind of anonymization tools, indeed, it is possible for misuse, frankly speaking. But for our tools, in particular the anti-censorship tools, is probably the last
choice for terrorists to use. It's because the encryption is only between the users in the censored countries to the proxy server. But once you get to the proxy server, you get from proxy server to the destination is completely open. So it's just like using a normal internet. So that's the, so if they can do anything so there is no advantage for using our tools for the terrorists. It's just like using a usual internet. So there is a difference between these two concepts.
Hi, I'm Emily from Digital Democracy. One thing that I heard emerging, which is something that I think is really important, is the idea of how citizen journalists, how activists can learn how the different new media tools can be used and how to use them effectively. So what I would call new media literacy. Just as media literacy is critical of the 20th century, I think new media literacy is critical of the 21st. And I'm curious if you can share any case studies of how people on the ground have maybe learned learned how to use the correct tools and use them effectively, particularly in terms of addressing security concerns.
Thank you. And I'd also just like to possibly add to that question. It was a question of mine. Again, the notion of if you have these tools available, the very nature of these tools are things we couldn't have thought about years ago. And sort of there's the assumption that anything's possible and who knows where we'll be in a few years. So if somebody gives me a flash drive preloaded with Tor or something, and I'm a civil society activist in Ashgabat, and says I can browse the internet or communicate or send email to people in Washington or friends in Europe or whatever safely, how do I have the confidence? And how do I know that, some of it's like, well, I can put a really serious lock on my door, but if my door is a pine wood door, then the lock doesn't have to be broken, you just break the door. Or if I have an encryption key that's very serious, but the stick-it is right there on, or someone's in the room with me at an internet cafe, or there's, who knows, is there an internal camera in the computer, keystroke monitoring? And it seems like how fast this technology changes, can the end user, who's not, a computer, nerd or whatever, a geek or whatever, somebody who's really seriously technical about this, but someone who's else, a journalist, a citizen, can it ever get to the point where there's adequate confidence, particularly in societies where the price for being discovered can be serious? It could be prison, it can be worse, and I think that's part of the literacy as well. And just is that, can you sort of, round that square or whatever? How do you address that? And please, Eddie.
Yeah. It's a very critical issue, and let me put it this way. Freedom House works with activists in many repressive environments, and I can think of at least a couple cases, well, several, with activists from very repressive environments who are very sophisticated as activists, and they were, frankly, very naive about the security of their online communications. And there was one in particular who was, her email was tracked, and it turned out that her email was literally firstname.lastname@yahoo.com. So things that, we would find pretty obvious aren't necessarily that obvious to even sophisticated activists. And this is, we're talking about the basics in this example. I mean, once you get into, using different anti-censorship tools or Tor or, Hushmail, Vaultlet, those kind of things, it takes some training, frankly. I mean, there probably are some users in places like Iran or Saudi Arabia or wherever who can kind of learn it themselves. But in many cases, they're more likely to learn it if they come into, let's say, face-to-face contact with people who understand it and can explain it to them.
I've learned an important lesson in working with the Tibetan independence movement and and others is that, we can't presume what people are or not willing to do for their own freedom and liberty and democracy. We can't say, oh, if they do that, they might get arrested and go to jail or get killed, and we can't do that. These are people, as we saw in Iran, who are willing to take to the streets and die for their freedom. And, it's an important fact to remember to not presume that you want to protect them. As far as a case study, a good friend of mine is part of Text Power in the Philippines, and I really like this model because it's very simple. And Tonio Cruz is named, but there's a whole group of people in the Philippines that have used text messaging not to go to Twitter or the internet, not to be centralized. Everything, we get so caught up on having all these people out here texting to the middle and going back out. What they figured out in the Philippines is about your phone going to other phones, this kind of edges, right? And use of messaging built on top of the constructs of society and using what they already knew how to do. Like everyone in the Philippines knows how to take a text and forward it to their address book. So they use that technique as opposed to forcing new behavior and saying, oh, what you should use is Twitter. When Twitter came out in the Philippines, it wasn't a big deal. And they said, well, why should we use that? It's centralized. So I think there's cases where you look at the behavior, of what users are already doing and help them do it better.
Well, I think the question of literacy is actually very important. I think there should be more ways to train activists not only in the use of tools, but also raise awareness about the vulnerabilities and risks that even such basic activities as social networking, for example, bring. Even if you are perfectly anonymous, if you do have accounts on several social networks, for example, right, but just overlapping those different social networks, you can learn quite a lot, if not about yourself, then about people in your networks. There is actually a lot of interesting security research going into this question of the social graph, right? And there are, scientific studies which do prove that you can glean a lot of information simply by overlapping the presence of people on various sites like Flickr or YouTube or Facebook, right? So, and I'm not sure that activists are aware of that, right? They think that just because I use Tor, just because I use, Gmail, I'm untraceable, right? And in essence, they don't realize that by joining any of the Web 2.0 websites, they kind of give up part of their anonymity and they give up part of their, sovereignty or whatever you want to call it. And I'm not sure they realize that. The second point I want to make here is that there will always be the human factor involved here, and you would never, no matter how secure your technology is and no matter how many trainings you run, you'll still run into basic problems, particularly in authoritarian regimes where, torture is much cheaper than hacking. It is much cheaper to go and torture an activist and ask him for his password than to hire 10 hackers who will then go and crack his inbox, right? And as long as that's the case, I think we can be building all sorts of tools, but the reality on the ground will be that, well, you either use temporary email and your email, inbox self-explodes in 2 weeks, or you just act even more securely. So I think, I think these emerging threats are not yet fully understood, and I think we need to start looking into them and sort of going beyond these tools discussions that we've been having.
I would just add a couple quick things on the library toolkit question. I think absolutely. We think that the tools are evolving, and they're generally moving in the direction of easy to use and easy to sort of get your head around. So the strategies are what it's all about. It's about identifying the levers of power in a country, understanding the political environment, the law, the legislative process, et cetera, and then designing strategies, using toolkits if you can to sort of get the general ideas, and then designing strategies that can affect change using those levers. And so, yeah, so absolutely, and then you got to find good partners in these countries who can really sort of get their head around this and move it forward, and that's, I think those are the keys to success. On the question of confidentiality and anonymity, I think we, or at least me and my team, we're pretty conservative on this with our staff and our partners. I generally sort of use the analogy of locking the doors but leaving the windows open, similar to what Kyle was saying. the technologies, you're never all that certain how secure you're going to be. We think our real vulnerabilities are in our physical offices, where people print something off the internet, or they download something, or they have cookies on their machine, or they do, any number of things. And when NDI finds itself in difficult situations, it's usually an unfriendly knocking at the door. It's usually not some kind of a surveillance, especially surveillance technology, especially in countries that aren't as the China and Russia. Absolutely, that's an issue. But a lot of the smaller countries with less resources, we really view our vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities of our partners in this issue related to how they choose to use the information that they happen to find on the web, and leaving paper in the trash, and all the more obvious things. So do that first, and then think about the technical things.
Just to make a quick comment about Kyle's saying that, indeed, for a lot of users in closed societies, they are not sophisticated or computer-savvy users. So it's from our experience over the past, for a computer-savvy user to get around the firewall, it's not difficult at all, because all the circumvention ideas are based upon the proxy server idea. So as long as you can find, for example, I'm in Beijing, I want to go to CNN.com, I cannot go. I found a third-party so-called proxy server in the free country, and we hook to that, and that's like a detour, and that server can get information from CNN and pass it to me. So that's the basic fundamental idea of circumvention. Okay? So if for a computer-savvy user, this is not a hard thing for them to do at all. So for small-scale operation to penetrate firewall, it has been existing, when the internet started. So it's widely used for, in the computer circle, the computer scientist circle. However, so what we are talking about now is to make a decisive and massive efforts to tear down the wall. So that is for any user, an everyday user, has no computer knowledge at all even. As long as he knows how to get internet, okay, then he can just use the little tool and double-click it, and then he can penetrate the firewall. So that's the very, very challenging work. So that's the, first of all, your tool needs to be scaled up, to be designed specifically for the computer, ignorance, even, ignorant users, and also has to protect their safety. So that's the work that we are aiming at.
Well, we've come to the end of our time today. It's obviously we intended this to sort of be a survey discussion. There's so many facets of this. I can see, I can see us exploring further. The technical side. Sort of a how-to, what's available, the state of the art, sort of a cookbook for activists and citizens. The policy side, addressing the issue of terrorists using these technologies, or other questions, and then hearing from people who've really put this to use on the ground, sort of the pragmatic. So I can see that we will be discussing this further, and this, like I said, this will be published and become an official government product. And when we had the idea to do this, we looked, and CRS, the Congressional Research Service, no ready-made product on it. As far as I can tell, no other congressional hearing specifically on this yet, and I expect that all to change in the coming future. There's a lot of pending legislation. So it's certainly something this particular audience here on the Hill is very interested in, and we will continue to discuss. I'd like to thank the audience and all of you for the questions, for coming today, to our distinguished panel for your excellent presentations and all the work you're doing. And also to Chris Doughton and Max Dewis for basically putting this event together. And I'd like to thank you all also for putting up with the uncivilized buzzers that we have. It sort of comes with the venue. But with that, we'll adjourn the discussion here.